Hey, what's up? Zach here. And the Puma Fusion Nitros are pretty easy to pick out of a crowd, and there certainly is some interesting tech on board these shoes. However, there's also some pretty head-scratcher design choices on these two. So let's go through the biggest pros and cons of these shoes and see if the Fusion Nitros may or may not be the shoe for you. So right off the bat, I'd say the biggest and most obvious con is the lacing system. Now I know this is a pretty interesting design. You got the big X and the really long shoelaces. However, you're skipping a lot of lace eyelets, which is what usually gives the shoe all of its stability. And when you get the laces going really long without a break point or a point of fixation into the shoe, it becomes really hard to control. Just imagine walking a dog. You can control where that dog's going a lot better when the leash is really short versus when it's really long and they can just kind of walk back and forth across the road. If you want to keep the dog to your side, you keep the leash short, and if you want to keep your foot secure, you keep the laces short too, which obviously isn't happening here. Now there are some benefits to this design because there is no lace eyelets in the middle of the shoe and there is just this elastic band that goes across. If you are somebody with more midfoot arthritis or lumps of bone on the top of your foot, or just need a little bit more accommodation on the top of your foot, say you have a really high arch right in the middle here, well, the shoe's going to accommodate a lot more because the only thing there is elastic. The problem is there's no shoelace eyelets or points of fixation in two really common spots that we see injuries, especially in a basketball court. Number one, right here at the Liz Frank joint. I'm sure you've heard of that a lot, maybe more in American football. That's right here at one of the midfoot joints that can easily be sprained. Those ligaments aren't very strong, and typically there's a shoelace eyelet there to give the shoe a lot of protection and a lot of stability right there. And when you're in these, you can actually feel your foot move around a little bit right in this area. Also on the outside of the shoe, right here at the fifth metatarsal, which is where we see a lot of what's called Jones fractures. If you've been paying attention to the NBA, you'll know that Zion Williamson has been out for quite some time with a Jones fracture, which usually happens right about here, right where there's no points of fixation in the shoe. Now, I know that elastic has become in vogue a little bit more, especially with shoes like the Adidas Next Level Future Natural. However, the Adidas Next Level has 3 layers of elastic, and the Adidas Next Levels are a lot wider. Elastic just is not a great way to close down a shoe. Number one, you need so many layers of it to create a vacuum seal around your foot. And number two, if the elastic gets too tight, well, it's going to constrict your foot, and when it starts to loosen, you're not going to get a lot of stability in the shoe in the uppers. So remember, at least for now, the only thing that's giving the shoe a ton of stability from inside to outside are the shoelaces, and that lack of stability was really evident during the suicide test, where I came in well over 15 seconds just because I was so afraid of taking corners in these, because I could feel my foot start to move side to side in the shoe because there just wasn't anything locking me down. That elastic just wasn't containing my foot. So on straightaways, these shoes were actually really good, the midsole engage, which we'll talk about soon. However, just going around corners, I just didn't feel that confident, so I really was slowing down around those turns. Now the next biggest pro and con of the Fusion Nitros comes from its weight distribution. Now it's not so much an issue of how much the shoe weighs, it's how that weight is distributed. The Fusion Nitros are pretty bottom heavy, and that comes from that EVA foam in the midsole. Now this is that nitro foam, which is infused with nitrogen, given the name. Now what that's supposed to do is give it a lot more spring back. What it really does is it makes the midsole pretty dense, and it gives it a lot of weight underfoot. Now these shoes are incredibly stable in the midsole, and it does give your foot a ton of support, especially on the inside or medial side of the shoe, which we'll get to when we talk about the fit. However, I didn't notice a ton of bounce out of the Fusion Nitro. So if you're looking for a shoe that has a lot of stability, especially on the medial side, and a shoe with a lot of density under your foot, something with a ton of shock absorption and impact protection, then the Fusion Nitros are fantastic. It's just when you get to more explosive movement out of these shoes, there is something a little bit lacking versus something with Zoom Air or something with bounce foam. And a perfect example of this is the jump height test. I got 29 centimeters on average, which in and of itself isn't bad. It's just not the explosive jump height of something like the Jordan 36 or the LeBron 19, where I was getting up 36, 38 centimeters of jump height. Whereas on the Fusion Nitros, they just are so bottom heavy that sometimes you're just kind of dragging the shoe along versus a shoe that can really store and release a lot of energy, even though there is a ton of nitrogen infused into the midsole foam and it is really bouncy when you press on it. When you get it underfoot, it does feel pretty dense underneath of you. However, even though I didn't find a lot of violent jump force out of the Fusion Nitros, I did find some other interesting things things, I found when I was charging front to back when the shoe was in a straight line, I was getting a lot of spring back the more energy I put into the shoe. So from a standing position, it was kind of hard to get a lot of spring back and energy return. However, when I was just going back and forth, I did notice as soon as I started picking up speed and momentum, the shoe started giving me more and more and more back. The other thing I noticed is when I was going up for layups or rebounds and I was coming down on my foot, I found that when I came down and I was giving the shoe a lot of energy just in me falling down to the ground, I found that the shoe really responded better once I was giving it a lot more energy. So for someone that's rebounding or just needs a lot of impact protection or kind of that second step force, these shoes do really well with that. I think that's pretty different in this midsole versus some other shoes we've seen this year, which are just really good at that first step takeoff. These shoes are really good once you've kind of gotten going a little bit more. Now, if you look at the outsole, these are kind of a walking contradiction. If you look at the durability test, the Dremel 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, only about 1.5 millimeters of damage, which is pretty darn good. However, the tread depth is only 2 millimeters, so there's just not a lot of rubber there to bottom out. The other thing I found was that the Fusion Nitros grip better on an outdoor court versus indoor hardwood, even though when you kind of feel the rubber, it feels a little softer, it's got that scaling pattern, which you think would interact better with a more organic, like hardwood surface. However, when I was on outdoor courts, these really didn't move an inch, whereas on an indoor court, I did find myself sliding just a tad. But what I love about the Fusion Nitros versus a lot of other basketball shoes in the space is that you get so much rubber here up in the toe cap and on the inside or medial side of the toe box. And that's really nice because if you have more creative footwork, you're in awkward positions, or it's really like to push off of your big toe or the inside of your foot, these are going to give you a ton of grip from those positions versus a lot of other basketball shoes where when you get to that position, you're basically standing on fabric. And in addition to that, if you look at the upper durability test, the Dremel 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper really didn't get through that top layer of the upper material, and then you have all that rubber coming up over there. So these shoes are going to be one of the more durable shoes for upper durability and toe dragging or sliding durability. But the most important factor if these are going to be a shoe for you or not is going to be their fit. And the Fusion Nitros do have a pretty niche fit profile. Now they will fit a narrow, medium, and wide width. However, if you are a 2E or above, you might want to consider going up a half size unless you're a 2E in like a really snug fitting shoe. Now, if you're more of a narrow footed player, remember the laces are more narrow too, so you might be sliding around that shoe a little bit. So for a narrow, even though it will fit you, it might not be the best shoe for you. If you're somebody with a higher arch or a more C-shaped foot, I probably would avoid these because they don't have a lot of lateral stability just because of the lace line in the uppers, so you might find yourself spraining or turning more. However, if you're somebody with a flatter foot or overpronation, these shoes are one of the better shoes out there for flat-footed basketball players just because they do give you so much density under the inside of your foot. So if you're a player that wants a shoe that's going to keep the bottom of your foot feeling pretty fresh, your arch feeling pretty resilient even after hours in this shoe, and you're willing to kind of get used to how this shoe moves, then yeah, these shoes are going to be a pretty good pickup for you, especially if you're someone that needs a shoe for kind of shoot around practice. You're going to go shoot a bunch of free throws and just want your feet feeling pretty fresh afterwards. Just remember, once you start cutting back and forth, you really got to get used to how the shoe moves. Otherwise, like I said, you can get yourself into a little bit of instability. But more than any other basketball shoe I've reviewed this year, I really want to hear your thoughts on these in the comments section, just because I personally keep going back and forth on these. I really like the way they make my arch feel. I like how resilient and fresh my feet feel in them, but I don't love the instability or the potential instability of them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about these in the comments down below. Let me know if these are a pickup for you or not. And to be honest, I am pretty impressed with the Puma Nitro midsole, and you can really tell why it was originated in the running space, just because when you're running in a straight line over a long period of time, imagine how much kinetic energy you're giving into these shoes and how much it's giving back to you, and just kind of keep your feet a lot more resilient than a lot of other running shoes in the space right now. Now, if you want to check out a sneaker with a midsole design specifically for basketball and the demands that basketball places on the foot, make sure you check out my teardown of the LeBron 19s above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam, and nitrogen in this case. I'll see you in the next video.